Namaskar, good evening. First, I would like to acknowledge that I'm sitting here today on the ancestral unceded territory of the Kokitlam First Nation. I'm grateful. My name is Supriya Bhattacharya. I'm the president of the Lower Mainland Bengali Cultural Society, in short LMBCS. This society was established 40 years ago. It is a not-for-profit organization promoting and preserving Bengali culture in British Columbia. Our society is completely run by volunteers. Tonight's session is the first of a series of 4, possibly 5 lectures. We are extremely fortunate to have distinguished professors who willingly agreed to share their knowledge with us. It is very humbling that in the midst of a pandemic and as our homeland West Bengal is recovering from the rampage of Cyclone Amphan, we all have gathered here tonight to gain some knowledge about our history. This idea of having the lecture series came from one of our founding members, Dr. Chinmay Banerjee, and I'm very thankful for that. I'd also like to acknowledge the Center for India and South Asia Research, UBC, for supporting this webinar. Before I introduce our first speaker, I would like to talk about tonight's event a bit. First off, I would like to thank Rajesh Chakraborty for creating the beautiful poster. Tonight we have Dr. Rotri Chatterjee, our cultural secretary, who is handling the technical side, and Dr. Madhumanti Mondal will assist him. After the talk, we'll have a question and answer session. You can send your question through the Q&A icon or typing it in the chat box, or use the icon to raise your hand. Madhumanti will attend to them as they come. Please mute your microphones for the whole duration and bear with us if we have technical difficulty or delay. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to introduce our first distinguished speaker, Dr. Tamal Dasgupta. He is in India. He's with us from New Delhi now. So Dr. Dasgupta is an assistant professor of English at Ambedkar College, University of Delhi. He has done his MA in English from Jadavpur University and PhD in English from Calcutta University. His dissertation was on Terry Eagleton's cultural theory involving Irish nationalism, Catholicism, and Marxism. He is the founder chairman of Shoptadinga Foundation, an academic body devoted to the study of history and culture of the Bengali people. He is also the founder of 2 journals, Shoptadinga and Journal of Bengali Studies, which are published in English and Bengali. Under the aegis of Shoptadinga Foundation, he has organized 9 seminars, some of which took place at ancient ruins. He has authored an 18-part online, very popular history series on ancient Bengali as well. Tonight's lecture will offer a brief overview of the trajectory that kingship takes in the early period of Bengal prior to the Turco-Afghan invasion, and the discussion would start from the earliest antiquity and would continue till the Sena period. Over to you, Professor Dasgupta. Please welcome him.
Thank you, Supriya. Those words of introduction about your organization was really illuminating. I congratulate your organization for this noble initiative. I do not know many Bengali associations who organize talks on Bengali history and Bengali culture. Therefore, sincere congratulations. And the other day I was going through an article written by Bhupendranath Dotto, a younger brother of Swami Vivekananda, and these chats are a little distracting. Is there any way in which I can not see them? I don't know. But anyway, yeah. Yeah. So, so there is an article written by Bhupendranath Dotto in which he raises this question that why, indeed, in medieval Bengal, uh, the Chaitanya Renaissance is not followed up by some kind of political emergence, like it has happened in case of Guru Nanak's Sikhism uh, in Punjab, or Ram Das's Bhakti movement in Maharashtra. In both the cases, there were emergences of the Sikh and the Maratha Empire, respectively. Now, why such a thing does not happen in Bengal? And while that question is not pertinent for today's discussion, because today we will conclude our discussion at the Sena period, nevertheless, the paradigm that he proposes, the paradigm that Dr. Bhupendranath Dotto proposes, that might be useful for us. Because what he is suggesting essentially is this, that there is some kind of a cultural narrative which is then followed up by some kind of polity. And we may all agree that the relationship between this kind of cultural narrative and a political narrative, this might not be unidirectional. This might be a both-way interaction, and it might not flow in a single direction. For example, there is one article of mine where I have argued that the rise of Pratapaditya during the medieval period actually paved the way for the Kheturi Mahotsava. Uh, Quite interesting. Pratapaditya is a Shakta. I mean, we do not think of him when we think of Vaishnavism, but actually there is a connection. But again, that is not pertinent for today's discussion. However, this cultural narrative and political emergence, this is going to be a useful paradigm for today's discussion. And so cultural narratives which are setting some kind of preconditions of a political emergence, and vice versa. So a both-way interaction. And when we are discussing about a political theory, I mean, whether it is possible to have a theory out of this political trajectory that we find in the early period, we will look at these cultural narratives, the socio-cultural religious narratives, which might have informed the foundation of the emerging polity. Now, one important question which must be answered before we embark on this journey: should we at all use the term Bengali while analyzing the topic which is under discussion today? Because I'm talking on, and I quote the title of this talk: Towards a Bengali Notion of Political Leadership, the Kings of Bengal from Earliest Times to the Sena Period. Now, Shashanko, I believe most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with this name. He is the most popular, most familiar icon from the early period of Bengal, which is our topic of discussion today. Now, Shashanko did not understand himself as a Bengali. He was a Gauriya. And but even as recent as the 19th century, Raja Ram Mohan Roy, he was writing the grammar of Gauriya language. Of course, he also did not consider his language to be Bengali, or he also might not have identified himself as a Bengali. So how do we indeed talk about Bengaliness? It is here probably better to define Bengaliness in terms of cultural narrative. Otherwise, we might end up in some veritable Tower of Babel, where we shall only have mutually incomprehensible dialects and regions and peoples and periods. And instead of any meaningful sequence, all we will have will be some unsolvable jigsaw puzzle. So it is better probably to inquire whether there is some kind of cultural narrative which is at the root and which is acting as a continuity. And that will help us in order to understand whether at all we can have a Bengali history, whether we can at all have a Bengali identity, whether it is possible to speak about a Bengali trajectory of political leadership as we look at these kings. Most of them, I mean, all of them, actually, all these kings whom we are going to discuss today did not identify themselves as Bengali. The term is of much later provenance, as I have just pointed out. Even as late as 19th century, the term was not in circulation about, you know, this kind of people, this community, as we identify ourselves today. So we shall stick to cultural narratives while trying to understand what Bengaliness is about. And this is in tune with the imagined communities concept. The concept of imagined communities, some of you might be familiar with it, a concept which is given by Benedict Anderson. And that has been in circulation for quite some time, 3 decades to be precise. And Yuval Noah Harari, I believe most of you should be familiar with his name. Yuval Noah Harari, though he does not use the same term, imagined community, he does not use this term. However, in his Sapiens, he basically means it when he is talking about the formation of a big community on the basis of some commonly shared narratives. We choose to believe in certain stories and we become different from the rest of the animal kingdom as we invent these stories and then choose to believe in these stories, and as these stories allow us to form big communities, which is essentially the process of community formation as well as nation formation. And these are imagined narratives which allow us to forge some kind of continuity, some kind of commonly shared foundation. So the question here is there a story, or are there stories which act as the foundation of Bengaliness? And this is particularly important about this early period, which we are going to discuss today. You see, the commonly prevalent norm today is the linguistic definition of Bengaliness. Whoever speaks in Bengali is a Bengali. Clearly, right now I'm not speaking in Bengali. That doesn't take away my Bengaliness away. That doesn't demolish my Bengaliness. So, and again, speaking in English, does speaking in English make somebody an Englishman? We know the problems of the linguistic definition. So it is a lot safer to use this parameter of cultural narrative in the definition of a community. And this thing will become clear as we shall proceed in today's discussion. Now, when we go to the earliest records of civilization in our part of the world, we go to Pandu Raja Dhibi, which is contemporaneous with the final phase of the Harappan civilization, that is roughly 4,000 years old. Pandu Raja Dhibi is in modern day Bardhaman district. It was a developed urban civilization, the third phase of which shows signs of external trade, foreign trade they used to have with Crete Island. We have got a seal from Crete Island from the excavations. It was the third phase of Pandu Raja Dhibi which witnessed a somewhat traumatic passage from the Copper Age to the Iron Age. Paresh Chandra Dasgupta, who carried out the excavations during the early 1960s, was a student of Ramesh Chandra Majumdar. The cultural artifacts which we find in the Pandu Raja Dhibi archaeological site, they point towards a mother worshipping culture. The rudiments of the symbolic script which we find there show evidence of some nascent form of written communication. We have also found a citadel. We have found gold coin. During the third phase, it suffered a devastating damage owing to a huge conflagration, which might have been the result of some kind of a battle, some kind of invasion, as Paresh Chandra Dasgupta assumes. A detailed synopsis of Paresh Chandra's report of excavation is there in Ramesh Chandra Majumdar's History of Ancient Bengal. So those who are interested might look it up. And also, Paresh Chandra Dasgupta's excavation report is published as a separate book by the State Archaeological Directorate. It was, of course, done under the aegis of State Archaeological Directorate in the 1960s, the Archaeological Directorate of West Bengal. We don't have any names of any kings from Panduraja TV. Historically speaking, however, this might correlate to the Pundra kingdom, a very ancient kingdom, as old as the Mahabharata war, at least as old as the Mahabharata war. Of course, Anga, Banga, Kalinga, Pundra, Sumha, these 5 kingdoms, they go back to the oldest antiquities, and this is basically there is this mythology about the origin of this Eastern Indian people, many of whom share some kind of a common root, and today who might be inhabiting this eastern part of the subcontinent. And so Pundra is one of them. And it was one of the most ancient and powerful nations to emerge in the eastern part of the subcontinent, and would be one of the forerunners of the modern Bengali people. But the only mention of any king of Pundra in the epic Mahabharata is that of Pondraka Vasudeva, who was a rival of Vrishni Vasudeva, more commonly known as Krishna, of Lord Krishna of Mahabharata. The rivalry was possibly centered around the cult of Narayana. Now, Narayana was a pre-Mahabharata, he was a pre-Mahabharata icon, and he probably hailed from some Aryan tribe, Aryan-speaking tribe named Nara. And though there is another suggestion that there was a person named Nara, and then there is Narayana, and these two were ancient sages. But we have evidence of a Narayana, who was a great warrior, a great and valiant warrior, who inaugurated the Pancharatra system of tantric worship. It was a particular kind of a tantric cult, and he was the leader, he was the founder of that tantric cult. And ever since, I mean, he became an icon. I mean, when Mahabharata was being written, it was not even prior to it was being written. I mean, when it was an oral ballad, when it was Jaya Kavya. So even in Jaya, you will find that before they utter a shloka, they hail Narayana. So and in Mahabharata, you have Narayani Sena of Krishna. So Narayan was a very important figure who introduced this tantric cult. And though today we look at the term Vasudeva as son of Vasudeva, but originally we have suggestions to believe that originally it was a title. It was the title of the cult. It was the title of the leader of the cult, the person who headed the cult of Narayana, this Bhagavata Dharma, later on, of course, known as Vaishnava Dharma. And though it has been postulated in Harivangsha that Pondraka Vasudeva was fathered by Vasudeva, I mean, who was father of Krishna, Lord Krishna as well. And the mother was Sutanu. The mother of Pondraka Vasudeva was Sutanu, who was a maidservant of Vasudeva. This is Harivangsha speaking, speaking from Harivangsha's testimony. But the term, in all likelihood, like I have told you, it was an honorific, and it was the title of the leader of the tantric cult of Pancharatra. And it was a particular type of tantric practice which celebrated different dimensions of the notion of Prakriti. And mark this term, Prakriti. It's something that we are going to frequently encounter today as we discuss early Bengali history. So different dimensions of the notion of Prakriti which we find in Sankhya and Tantra. The 4 insignia which we associate with the Krishna of Mahabharata today, that is Shankha, Chakra, Gada, and Padma. These were supposed to be carried by the leader of the Narayana Bhagavata cult. And so the rivalry was around this. The rivalry was because of this. Who's going to have these insignia? Who's going to be the leader? Who's going to carry Shankha, Chakra, Gada, and Padma? And the contest happened. Mahabharata attests. And the conflagration of Panduraja Dhidi is there. So should we make any correlation? Well, though Vrishnu Vasudeva attacked Varanasi and burnt it down, as per Mahabharata, but still it would probably be far-fetched to connect Pondraka Vasudeva with Panduraja Dhibi in the absence of any further concrete evidence, for which no doubt we have to search. But there is a catch. The devil is actually in the details. There is practically no search for ancient history of Bengal. That excavation in Panduraja Dhibi, which were carried out in 1960s, and then only one time when the excavation was restarted, but then it was stopped. It's still lying in a state of neglect. The most ancient archaeological site in Bengal. And how do we know our ancient history? I mean, how do we know our early history when there is no such? You must be aware that prior to Harprasad Shastri, we did not even know about Chaurjapat. And Chaurjapat could not have been discovered if he did not go to Nepal and ransack the library there. So who's searching for our ancient history? Practically nobody. No institution is doing that. So in the absence of any attempt, how do you know our history? So it's not easy to come across concrete evidence. However, sometime around the war of Mahabharata, this contest for the cult leadership and the title of Vasudeva took place. And if we consider the war of Mahabharata taking place somewhere, sometime around 1300 BC, then the time frame for the conflagration of the Panduraja Dhibi matches with that. Further, it is also difficult to speak of the kings of Panduraja Dhibi with any amount of certainty, given that all the Puranas literally censor Pundra. Here, without any further delay, I just want you guys to have some look at the images. I would and I want a different view. I would actually prefer to, yes, that would be wonderful. So wonderful. So Motamonti is operating these images, and that's easier for me. But is it possible for me to okay, Motamonti, is it possible for you to stop your share screen, and shall I just try? I mean, if it is yes, if it is possible for me to look at it from this thing, that yes. So here it will this is from the Eloquent Art collection from the West Bengal State Archaeological Directorate. You can actually look at the time frame. It says timeless. Truly, the time frame of Panduraja Dhibi is something about which it's very difficult to it's very difficult to come to a consensus because there are some consistent objections to the fact that many archaeologists, most importantly Parashandra Dasgupta, who carried out the excavation, and Ramesh Chandra Majumdar, who was his mentor, they concluded that this belongs to the late Harappan period, the final Harappan period, and so this is contemporaneous with that. But there are some objections from the Indian Archaeological Survey to that, so they are writing timeless, but it's actually 4000 BC. Now, these are some of the artifacts, and here you find, look at the right, the image on the right, and this is one of the earliest mother goddesses, and this is actually a goddess with a beak, a mother goddess with a beak, and this is the seal from the Crete island which we were talking about, and this evidence of foreign trade. Of course, the mainstream Harappan civilization on the western part of the subcontinent it had a flourishing foreign trade, but this part of the subcontinent and foreign trade in so you can understand. I mean, this belongs to a very early period. Now, this image on the top, that's quite fascinating. It's supposed to be the lower abdomen of a mother goddess in idol, and
excuse me, Dr. Dashgupta.
yes,
We are just seeing your whole screen. We are not able to see the zoomed.
okay.
Yeah.
I have made it full screen, but
we are not seeing it full screen.
Okay. I believe we have to do it from Madhumonti's. Madhumonti, over to you. Is it possible for you to do it from your side and just go to the Panduraja DB folder? Shall I stop share here? Yes, let me do that. I did this share screen thing, and yes. So let us go to this Panduraja DB folder. Yes. So yes, so the earliest mother goddess that we find from Panduraja DB. Yes, this is the image, and then let us just go forward. The next image. Yeah. So on the right side here, you have a mother goddess who has a beak. So some kind of a bird goddess. Okay. Yes. Let's go to the next slide. And here, this is a seal which has been considered as the seal from Crete island, and as an evidence that it had a flourishing foreign trade. Let us go to the next slide. Yes. So here, the image on the top, and these are all, all these images are actually from the excavation report of Panduraja DB. This report is published by State Archaeological Directorate, and this is the lower part. This is the lower abdomen part of a mother goddess idol. And this is one example. Paresh Chandra Dasgupta has considered it to be an example of early, as an early example of yoni worship. So the maternal organ, which is a symbol of all fertility. And so yeah, let us go to the next image. So here again, some kind of a rudimentary yoni image on the right. And yes, so let us go to the next slide. Now, these kind of fish images is very preponderant in the Harappan civilization. I mean, if you are familiar with the Harappan artifacts, then it bears a very close resemblance to that. Of course, Bengalis have a long connection with fish. Yes, let us go to the next slide. Now, this is something about which I want to talk now. It would be rather gory, probably gothic, but still you need to know that the inhabitants of Panduraja DB used to fragment their dead while giving a burial, as the excavations suggest. There also seems to be some form of secondary burial. In all likelihood, some ritualistic meaning was there. In these secondary burials, the components of the dead body used to be buried away from the original place of burial. And as you look at these images, I want to make a connection here. These kind of secondary burials and this kind of fragmentation of the dead, does it ring some kind of a bell with Shoktipit? These 51 Shoktipit, 51 fragments of the body. Asko Parpola, the renowned Indologist, made a connection between the burial of a decapitated man with the head of a horse in the Pontic steppes. He makes a connection between this headless man with a horse's head, you know, who was buried, and he connects it with the Dadhichi myth, because Dadhichi was provided with the head of a horse by the Ashwini Kumars, who were the divine surgeons, the divine doctors. And you can get to read it in Parpola's Quest for the Origins of Vedic Culture. Now, unfortunately, nobody has written a comparable work on the quest for the origin of this this kind of a tantric culture, which we have had in the eastern part of the subcontinent, but not just in the eastern part of the subcontinent, it was there in the Harappan civilization as well, very much there. If we use the same method used by Asko Parpola, then we may find in Panduraja Dhibi the rudimentary origin of the Shaktipit narrative, where the fragmented components of the body of the primordial mother were buried in different regions of the subcontinent, most of them in the eastern region. Shall we go to the next slide? If it is possible to go to the next slide. Yes, I mean, this is one example of that fragmented burial. And so Parpola constructs an entire theory of PIE, that is Proto-Indo-European, on the sole basis of that grave that he finds with the horse's head. And he says that, look, I mean, this is so typically early Indo-European, the Rigvedic, or even, you know, prior to Rigveda, the kind of Indo-Europeans who so Pontic steps, he finds a grave and he connects, he makes a connection. This connection, however, between Panduraja Dhibi burials, these kind of fragmented burials, some kind of ritualistic fragmented burials, and the Shaktipit narrative has not been done by anybody, not even by Ramesh Majumdar, not even by Paresh Chandra Dasgupta. They simply looked at it, they thought that it's probably some kind of a ritual. What if this ritual has some connection with this primordial myth of some ancient mother? Because I mean, these are mother worshipping people. Okay, we find that, and we find that they fragment their dead body while making burials. We also find that there are secondary burials. Does it connect itself to the Shaktipit narrative? Now I leave that open. I leave that as an open question. Now Pondraka Vasudeva, we can go to the next slide. Again, burial, I believe. Yes, some kind of a mutilated body, and some parts of the were taken away. But so the next image is, yeah, this is the citadel which is found there in Panduraja Dhibi. And Pondraka Vasudeva, when we get to know about his military might, I mean, those were formidable. He had 8,000 horse-driven chariots. He had 10,000 elephants, and he had innumerable foot soldiers. We may justifiably assume that such a military political complex probably needed some form of a strong cultural narrative. So was it here, this cultural narrative of the primordial mother? So with the conflagration that destroyed this Panduraja Dhibi, the Copperhead civilization comes to an end. And after this, the rebuilt city now will show signs of iron instruments. And from its ashes, a more powerful polity will emerge in Bengal, though towards the southern part and within a few centuries, and we shall know it as Ganga Rijai. Now let us go to the final image. Here, yes. Now it bears a strange resemblance with the Panduraja Dhibi artifacts, but this is from Chandraketugarh. Chandraketugarh, which is considered by most scholars to be the capital of the ancient people of Ganga Rijai, and that's a Greek term, of course. And now, with this, now I am opening the discussion on Ganga Rijai period, and you can look at this image. This is a mother goddess and a beaked goddess, and the very first image which you saw, it bears some kind of resemblance. So probably some kind of a continuity existed in spite of all the upheavals. So shall we go back and yes, so the Ganga Rijai folder, yes. Yes, so as we begin the Ganga Rijai, so the beaked goddess, yes. So the first image, yes. So here we have this beaked goddess image, and the next image, of course, you have just seen in the previous folder. And there are many goddesses, and before I briefly introduce you to all these mother goddesses, I shall tell you that legend has it that Alexander's army did not venture further east because they heard about Ganga Ridai, and they also heard about Prasoy, which is really Magadha. And now, who were these great people, and is it possible to find the king of the Ganga Ridai, as today we are discussing about kings from early Bengal? Now, cultural narrative. Here again, you find that mother worshipping culture as a strong kind of a force that binds these people together and forms this big community. We have a preponderance of these mother goddess, a particular mother goddess. Shall we just go to the next slide? This is just a fragment of as you can see, is the foot of a mother goddess, and she represents wealth, prosperity, and these coins that you find on her foot, these represent prosperity. Shall we go to the next? Now this is Aditi Uttanpad, also called Lojja Gauri. Here the primordial mother is in the posture of giving birth. Here it's like the mother goddess is giving birth, and this is a very familiar image. It is called Aditi Uttanpad. Uttanpad because her legs are in that position. I mean, when it is easier to give birth. So yes, and let us go to the next image. Here we have the mother goddess with an infant, and the next image. I wanted to come to that. Is it possible to have a full screen on this? I don't know. I mean, this is now this mother goddess. Variants of this mother goddess idol have been found in many places, not just in Chandraketu. I mean, this mother goddess, you can find her in Bangor, which is in northern part of Bengal, Pundra, of course, ancient Pundra. And you find this idol from Tamralipta as well. So, and she is sometimes referred to as Panchachura. I believe that's rather erratic to call her Panchachura. Panchachura is the name of an Apsara who comes out of the primordial ocean of churn, that is Samudra Manthan, that narrative. So there is this Apsara, and so when we had multiple idols, now there are many variants of, but the same thing gets repeated. I mean, you have this mother goddess who is here. She is flanked by 4 attendants, and she had 10 hairpins, and these hairpins are actually weapons, small minuscule weapons. So most of the times she actually has either 10 hairpins or 12 hairpins, and I think the name Panchachura does not really hold. And in any case, she is not just any mere Apsara. I mean, it is evident that she was like the one's thread of continuity, one geographical consolidation, as she her idol is found in all these different. I mean, if you look at it, I mean, it actually forms a kind of a triangle in modern day West Bengal. So you have the northern part, you have 2 corners of the southern part, Tamralipta, which is modern day Medinipur, and you have Chandraketu, which is modern day Chobbish Pargona. So these hairpins are really weapons, and this can very well be the very first precursor of the goddess whom we worship, I mean, with whom we are more familiar. She also has 4 attendants, yes, but of course you don't need any supernatural imagery here, because these are hairpins, so you do not need 10 hands to have 10 weapons. So but how wonderful is that, this image. And it's a particularly prosperous civilization, this Gangaridai civilization, and this is evident from this image. I mean, this goddess represents prosperity, no doubt about that. She represents wealth. Aishwarya, one of the, one meaning of the word is the bhava of Ishwar, but there is another meaning, wealth. So, I mean, this is wealth, and this is uh, so they had a flourishing international trade, mostly the trade of spice and a certain spice called long paper or pipali. And in order to show you an image of pipali, we have to probably go back to the previous folder. So we have to exit full screen. So after making an exit from the full screen, I believe the pipali image is in the main folder, webinar folder. So we have to go back. Okay, yeah, it is here. It is here. Yes. So now this is one cash crop that the Gongaridai people had. Hippocrates in 5th century BC, Hippocrates from Greece, he notes down the medicinal property of pipali or long pepper. And for buying half an ounce of this thing, Rome used to spend 15 gold coins. And most of that gold actually went to Bengal because Gongaridai, they had a kind of a monopoly over the production of long paper, pipali. And so this prosperity gets reflected. That idol reflects that prosperity which came from that international trade. And I have told you that this idol is a continuity that connects different parts of Bengal. And about Gongaridai, so it is evident that some kind of a strong cultural narrative was there. So shall we now go back to the Gongaridai folder? So yes, so the next image is that of the vegetation goddess. Yes, this is from Eloquent Art collection published by State Archaeological Directorate. Yes, so she is also an ancient mother goddess from Gongaridai. Now we can go to the next image. Now, yes, so mother goddess who has wings, a winged goddess. Now Diodorus, Strabo, Ptolemy, Quintus, Curtius, Rufus, Pliny, Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, all these, the last work is anonymous. Now all of them, they speak about the mighty kingdom of the Gongaridai. The Greek mythology also has mentions of the Gongaridai. Argonautica by Apollonius Rhodius speaks of a Gongaridai leader named Datis who fought in a war in modern day Georgia, somewhere near Central Asia. Now Virgil in his Georgics spoke very highly of the Gongaridai. And I quote, "On the doors I represent in gold and ivory the battle of the Gongaridai." Now clearly the Gongaridai were associated with prosperity, ivory and gold. And the artifacts from Chandraketu, their time frame corresponds to the Gongaridai, roughly the time when the Greco-Roman sources are speaking about Gongaridai. So archaeologists and historians, they have made this connection that Chandraketu is Gongaridai. And we have the account of Quintus, Curtius, Rufus, who depicted Mahapadmananda as the king of Gongaridai, who became the king of Prasi, that is Magadha. And the time frame here would be 350 before Christ. Now, let us go to the previous folder, this reconstructing Mahapadmananda. No, the Gongaridai folder will continue. Yes, reconstructing Mahapadmananda. Now, I should tell you here that no Indian source mentions Gongaridai. Like I told you, Pundra is kind of censored. In Pundra is not to be found. I mean, only Pondraka Vasudeva we find his mention. In Katha Sarit Sagara, there is a mention of the Swayamvara of Dukha Labdhika, the princess of Pundra, but otherwise you can find mentions of even very trivial dynasties from northern India in the Purana, but Pundra is not mentioned. Similarly, Gongaridai faces a similar kind of a censorship. This great goddess, this great mother goddess whom we saw a little ago, we really do not know how she was worshipped and what was her name. We really do not know anything about the Gongaridai. However, we know many references to the Nanda dynasty, the emergence of the Nanda dynasty, and we have this writer, this Roman writer, Quintus Curtius Rufus, who makes a connection between the Gangaridai king, and he very clearly says the Gangaridai king became the king of Magadha. So this Mahapadmananda, and so these are some of the images from the Chandraketu archaeological site. So we can go to the next slide. And here I'm just, so the left image, the image on the left, that is a male figure from Chandraketu. We can go to the next slide. So here, yes, another male figure, some kind of a royal figure. Note, yes, and here again, I mean, it's a smaller image, riding on some kind of animal, looks like a hybrid of a lion and a horse. So yes, and let us go to the next image. So yes, again a smaller image. So this is how the aristocratic people looked in. So probably, yeah, Mahapadmananda, we do not have any representation, but if he was from modern day Chandraketu, yes, he might have looked like this. Next image. There is no next. Okay, yeah. So let us go to the previous Gangaridai folder and the sexuality in Gangaridai. Now, multiple terracotta plaques which represent the act of sexual union that has been found in Chandraketu to the extent, you know, they are so very extensive that some people have suggested whether Vatsayana actually is from our modern day Barashat, Barashater Vatsham. Because many of these plaques, they represent those particular postures which Vatsayana comes with in Kama Sutra. Now, there are plenty of such images, and you can actually kind of fast forward. Now, there are other similar plaques, and they represent some kind of Prakriti Purush dualism, some kind of male-female union, which is very central to tantric conception of creation. And so this is how, you know, creation is symbolically portrayed in these terracotta plaques. And shall we just go very quickly to the other ones? Yes. And so this is from Eloquent Art. And here, this is not actually an example of union. Quite fascinatingly, here the male figure is not that of a child. It's not that of a child. It's a fully grown man, and probably an aristocratic figure, as you can make out from the crown on the head. So here, you know, Prakriti, which is carrying Purusha, and here it is a fully grown man. But by the way, I mean, Prakriti and Purush do not exactly correspond to male and female. I mean, we all are components of Prakriti. I mean, to be precise, you know, Prakriti is this entire universe, the animate and the inanimate world. We will come to that in the end. So, but here, I mean, what you find is a preponderance, a predominance of Prakriti over, you know, so the female principle, the mother goddess, carrying in her lap the king, so, or the king, or the polity, you know. So this kind of a mother worship culture which you can find it, I mean, whenever I look at this image, it reminds me of that very famous song of Antony Firingi, je shokti hoite utpotti she shokti tomar potni ki karon. If you are born from that shakti, I mean, how come? So yes, the next image, and here the floral, you know, the head instead of the head of the woman. I mean, here it turns into a floral motif, and that's probably ritualistic. And so I believe, I mean, these images are over. Okay, so let us now go back to the main Gangaridai fold. Okay, yes, one, yes. So we shall go back to the main Gangaridai folder. And so the military might of the Gangaridai, that is described in very formidable terms. They had 20,000 cavalry, they had 200,000 infantry, they had 2,000 horse-driven chariots, and they had 3,000 elephants. The last component being the most awe-inspiring. Now, Gangaridai has been connected with Kalinga as well by some Greco-Roman writers, and Kalinga was probably annexed to the Gangaridai Empire, and the famed Ashokan War, in all likelihood, it was probably waged against the Gangaridai people. Now we shall go to the main folder, the webinar folder, and I want to have a look at the Mahasthangar inscription. Now this is yes, the Mahasthan no yes, exactly after Jayanagar coin. Yes, this one. Yes. What you are seeing here is the earliest recorded script. Okay, acha. Okay, we are now in the I haven't even come to Shoshanko and the Pala and the Sena, but is it possible to get like 10 more minutes where I very quickly conclude?
Sure, but
Okay.
then we'll have less time for Q&A. But go ahead, 10 more minutes. Sure.
Okay. So fine. Mahasthangar inscription, the very first written evidence. This is in Eastern Brahmi, and it's from Pundra Nagar. Again, we were repeatedly talking about Pundra, and so it's referring to some kind of ancient disaster following which the common people there, they were given some kind of dole, some kind of relief from the state, and we find some names there. Now, is it possible to get the Samudragupta? There is a Samudragupta coin. Yes. So the next important thing, you know, after this this Mauryan period, we come to the Gupta period, and the founder of the Gupta dynasty, he was a king of the Pundra kingdom. And It Singh observes that in the Mrigasthapan Stupa, a temple was built by Srigupta, and Mrigasthapan Stupa was 40 yojana away from Nalanda in the eastern direction on the banks of Ganga. Now, modern day Malda or Murshidabad district matches with that description. Now, Malda and Murshidabad, that gives a cue here. Because here we are, you know, the ground is being prepared for the emergence of Gaura. From Pundra, the southern part will now emerge. And here, this is, we do not have any coin of Srigupta, but here is a coin of Samudragupta. Now, this particular pattern, you will see a kind of a continuation up to the Pala period, that you have the mother goddess, usually considered to be Lakshmi, on the reverse, and the obverse usually has an image of the king. Here, the queen as well as the king. So the obverse has, you know, this image of the dual figure of the king and the queen. So clearly some kind of a hint of, you know, the male female union. And the reverse, here you have the mother goddess. So clearly the Guptas had some kind of a tantric ideology, though it is not commonly assumed. Whenever people think of Gupta, they think of, you know, as a Vaishnava. Now this Vaishnava, this umbrella term, it within it a number of things are encompassed, which are probably tantric. Now, is it possible to get that image of mention of Srigupta in Samudragupta? Yes. So Samudragupta's Allahabad inscription, here is the mention of Srigupta written in Eastern Brahmi. Now, we shall go back and we shall look at the very first written inscription. Let us go back to the main folder. Now, the very first written description, written inscription of a king from Bengal is that of Chandra Varma. Chandra Varma, who is a contemporary, we have this, yes. Now, he was a Vaishnava, as we can make out from this chakra, which is here. So, modern day Shushunia Hills, we find this inscription. He is the first recorded king, you know, whose inscription we have found. The king whom we know by name, Chandravarma, a contemporary of Samudragupta. Now, Samudragupta in his Allahabad inscription also claims to have defeated Chandravarma. The Mehrauli iron pillar, the very famous Mehrauli iron pillar here in New Delhi, there is an inscription with the name of a king named Chandra, and many people identify that Chandra with this Chandravarma of Shushunia Hill. Now, the Mehrauli iron pillar inscription, it was not originally, and the iron pillar was not here in Delhi. It was brought from outside. So there is a possibility it was probably erected by Chandravarma. Now, we have a king named Vanyagupta. We go back to the, we exit full screen, and Vanyagupta, here is, yes, here is an inscription, Gunaighar inscription of Vanyagupta. Now we have come to the later Guptas. Now, the connection between Vanyagupta and the imperial Guptas, that's not really clear. We do not have any kind of a formal genealogy which can connect, and he doesn't mention it in this land grant. This is basically a land grant, and Vanyagupta was ruling sometime around 510 AD. So that is probably the time frame. Now, after Vanyagupta, Vanyagupta was ruling from Samatata. Samatata is modern day Eastern Bengal, the coastal part of Eastern Bengal, really. And then he is the southern part of Eastern Bengal, and then he is replaced by Rajbhata. Rajbhata of the Kharga dynasty. The Kharga dynasty replaces, of course, I mean, between the rule of Vanyagupta, is it possible to go back? Rule of Vanyagupta and the rise of the Kharga, we have the Chandra dynasty. So I do not think I have anything from the Chandra dynasty, but Rajbhata. There is a coin of Rajbhat. Yes, 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 coin of Rajbhat. Now, the coin which you are looking at here, again, you have the same kind of a motive. You know, on the obverse, you have the king. On the reverse, you have the mother goddess. And it's quite interesting to observe here that Gopal, the renowned founder of the Pala dynasty, has been considered to have descended from Rajbhata. He has been called Rajbhata Vamshadipotito. So one who has been somehow come from, you know, and who has come from, but who was Potito from that lineage. So he has this connection with Rajbhata. Now, this is the Kharga dynasty, a Buddhist dynasty ruling in Shamotot, the eastern part, the southern part of Eastern Bengal. I told you that Srigrupta's original paternal kingdom, I mean, he was originally from Pundra, and he was originally from the southern part of Pundra, modern day Malda and Murshidabad. And I just told you that the backdrop was being created for the rise of Gaura. Now, Gaura, it's from Gur, Jaggery. Again, another agro business of the ancient Bengali people, and Gaura was known for its prosperity. And we need to keep in our mind here that honey was an exclusive luxury, while the mass production of jaggery was no less a culinary, cultural, economic, and social revolution in those days. So Gur, and you have Gaura, and of course Pundra. Pundra is also the name of a sugarcane. So it was actually a cash crop, that particular type of sugarcane, and Pundra received its name from that. The first king of Gaura. Now, if we can go to the coin of Jayanagar, there are two Jayanagar coins. Now, many of you might suffer from some kind of cognitive dissonance if I say that this is the first king of Gaura and not Shashanka. But there is an article. You can, those of you who read Bengali, you can Google and you will find this article in Bengali. And till date, this is the only full-fledged study on Jayanagar. And here in this coin, you find joy on the obverse. You have the king's figure, and you have the figure of Prakriti or Lakshmi or Mother Goddess, most commonly considered to be Lakshmi. Now, what is written is Prakanda Yasha, Prakando Josh. So this is the Birud. This is the royal name of Jayanagar. And shall we go to the coins of Shashanko? Is there a separate folder? I believe there is a separate folder on Shashanko. Shashanko, yes, yes. Here you can find most of the coins of Shashanko actually have joy on the obverse. I mean, here you have Shiva. So here is a departure. In fact, the coins of Jayanagar are much closer to the Gupta coinage than Shashanko. Here in Shashanko, you have Shiva riding on a bull, and on the obverse you have Jaya. And so this is the first coin. This is the first coin of Shashanko that I have. And the reverse here, the reverse might not be fully visible because I see a thumbnail here. But it's written Shri Shashanka. Shall we go to the next coin? Shashanko coin 2. And here again you have Srija. So written in Srija, both the coin number 2 and coin number 3, Srija. Now Ja, what does it signify? And coin number 4, if we go to coin number 3 and coin number 4, all of them, coin number 5, because we have very little time, all of these coins, there is an album in my Facebook page where I have all these like 12 coins of Shashanka which we have found till there. All of these coins which I have today, all these 6 coins, they have Jaya written. Okay, these 5 coins, all of them, they have Jaya. So that probably makes some kind of connection between Jaya, because Jayanag's coin also had Jaya written on it. Now, very briefly, 2 points about Gaura Tantra. Shashanka's kind of his system of administration has been referred to as Gaura Tantra. Now, probably it was literally some kind of a tantra celebrating a form of union of Prakriti and Purusha, as symbolized by the union of Shiva and Nilavati, which was behind the conception of Bengali New Year, if we consider the origin of this current Bengali New Year during Shashanko's time, because the time frame matches. But of course, there is a contesting argument that it was started by Akbar. But if it actually started in the early period, then the Bengali New Year definitely has something to do with the marriage between Shiva and Nilavati, which is still celebrated, Chaitra Sankranti, and the end of the previous year. I mean so the New Year starts with the union, the holy union of the primordial father and the primordial mother. And so Shashanko's Gaura Tantra, the dominating ideology was probably that. And here I would like to point out Shashanko's anti-Buddhist prejudice has been much talked about, and he actually uprooted the Bodhi Vriksha, that tree, the Bodhi tree, which is associated with the name of Lord Buddha. Now, Buddhism in its Theravada avatar represents the dissociation, the divorce of Prakriti and Purusha, and it attains moksha by that dissociation. Now, if Shashanko was propagating a particular philosophy, a particular cultural narrative that celebrated the union of Prakriti and Purusha, then probably that might have acted as the reason behind his uprooting of the Bodhi tree. People have sometimes assumed that Harsha, his main rival in the political battlefield, was a Buddhist, and therefore Shashanko attacked the Bodhi tree. Now that doesn't make much of a sense, because Harsha was a Shaiva. Harsha sometimes patronized the Buddhists, that is all. But in his inscriptions, Harsha refers to himself as a Shaiva. In his biography, in his authorized biography, Harsha Charita, written by his court poet Banabhatta, he is referred to as Shaiva. So Harsha was a Shaiva, just like Shashanko. So it's so yes, this union of Prakriti and Purush, this is quite fascinating, I believe. I mean, and we find that probably this was a dominant ideology during Shashanko's time. And the Agra copper plate, is it possible to have very quickly a look at the Agra copper plate? This is the Agra inscription, and this inscription was issued probably sometime after Shashanko's rule came to an end. And it's fascinating to observe that Gaura Tantra was run really in a cooperative manner, because here you find 35 officials. Some of them are elected, not all of them are like nominated from above. And here, I mean, this stands out from rest of the royal inscriptions that you usually found, where you have a Dutaka, who's usually some kind of a royal figure, maybe the army commander-in-chief, maybe the maybe the crown prince. But here you do not have any this kind of a single kind of a sole authority. Instead, you find that Gaura Tantra, probably in the absence of Shashanko, after Shashanko's rule came to an end, Shashanko died, it was being run in a cooperative system. And Prakriti Punja, in fact, the collective body of the people that will eventually elect Gopala after the Matsanya. Matsanya is the rule of the logic of the fish, roughly translated from English. Shall we just go back to the main folder? And here you find a little bit of mention of Matsune. I'll just very quickly gloss it over. Now, during Matsune, there was a lot of anarchy, and there is an unnamed king of Gaura who was killed by the king of Kashmir, Lalitaditya Muktapir. who falsely promised uh, in front of the idol of Parihasa Keshava, having Parihasa Keshava as the witness and as the guarantor of his pledge that he's not going to harm the king and the queen of Gaura. And so he invited them to visit Kashmir. But after they visit Kashmir, he kills the king of Gaura and rapes the queen of Gaura. Now, 5 Gaurias, they decided to avenge. And this is a story which is narrated in Kalhana's Raja Tarangini, that chronology from Kashmir. And so these Gaurias go to Kashmir, but Lalitaditya at that point of time was out of Kashmir. He was not there. And they decided that they will destroy the idol of Parihasa Keshava, but mistakenly they destroyed the idol of Ramaswamy. And after 600 years, when Kalhana was writing his Raj Tarangini, that temple of Ramaswamy was still empty. And it bore a testimony to the valor of these Gauriya people who took the dishonor of their kingdom very seriously. And they avenged. Now, we come to the Pala era, and very quickly the folder, the Pala folder. So yes, so this is Chamunda, and beneath you have this body. I mean, originally Chamunda is seated. If you look at the next image, you will also realize originally Chamunda is seated on some kind of a dead body. But here, yes, I mean, this is a dead body which is in like a totally prostrate, kind of a totally helpless kind of a situation. The previous image, however, shows ample signs. Now, both of these images, both of these idols, these are stone idols, and both of them have been recovered from the Varendra region. Varendra, that is the northern side of Bengal. Both of them are from, I think one is from Dinajpur, one is from Rajshahi. One is from northern Dinajpur of modern day West Bengal, and another is from Rajshahi district of Bangladesh. Now here you find the dead body is actually getting transformed into Shiva, and this is a forerunner of the modern day Kali image. The Shava, the dead body, will eventually turn to Shiva. And here this particular posture of the body, you will find it is kind of a, you know, the way Shiva is in a relaxed kind of a posture, you know, beneath the feet of. So this is a Chamunda image, but it already shows signs. Now, very quickly, if it is possible, so this is Chamunda, and sometimes also called Charchika. Now, the Palas never forged any mythological genealogies, creating links to Surya Vangsha and Chandra Vangsha and the like. And this is very unusual. If you are familiar with the royal dynasties and royal genealogies of the rest of India, you will realize that this is very unusual. And probably this ideology of Prakriti, is it possible to go to the next image? And so this is a coin of Devapala. Devapala, the one of the greatest emperors of the Pala period. So this is the only gold coin we have found till date of Devapala. Now the next image would probably be Dharmapala's image. Is it possible to go to the next image? Yes. So this gold coin has been very recently discovered. The Devapala coin is of like, I mean, it's at least some 70-80 years old. I mean, it was discovered 70-80 years ago. But this coin, and for a very long time, this is the cover image of my Facebook page. And here you find Devapala attacking a boar, a wild boar. Boars, by the way, used to be the icon. Varaha is a you know, avatar of Vishnu. Now Varaha was the icon of the Pratihara, the Gujara Pratihara, who were the main rivals of the Pala Empire at that point of time. And here you find Dharmapala. The obverse says Shriman Dharmapala, and here Dharmapala riding on a horse. He is killing the boar. He is killing the Varaha. And of course, you find the mother goddess on the reverse, and it is written Shri. And so let me very quickly tell you that Dharmapala founded 50 universities. We can have very quickly, you know, some images of those, a few of those universities. He founded 50. So this is the Paharpur University, which is in modern day Bangladesh. It was called Somapura. We can go to the next image. So he founded all these universities. Now this is an image. This is quite interesting. Now this is an image of Mahipala's coin, Mahipala's gold coin. Now Pala Empire lasted for 450 years, which is an unusually long period. All over the world, you find very few royal dynasties which last this long. So naturally, it went through some upheavals, went through some ups and downs. So there was a time when Pala Empire was actually crumbling down, and then it was Mahipala who restored the empire to its former glory. And you find a coin of Mahipala here, and I have associated Mahipala's rise with the emergence of the cultural narrative of Sahajayana. And two main proponents of Sahajayana you can find in the next two images, Nara and Nari. From Nara and Nari, we have modern day and medieval Nara and Neri. That was Horoprasad Shastri. And here, this is a Tibetan image of Nara. Naropa wrote Chaujapad as well. And a professor at Vikramshila University. Here you have Nigu Dakini, Niguma, also called Nari. And Nara and Nari, these two icons, they gave birth to Sahajayana, which I have argued in one of my articles that that was behind the re-emergence of the Pala Empire. And Dharmapala was there, Mahipala was there, and you have seen the coin of Devapala as well. Now, of course, we come to the Sena period. And here this is one of the universities founded, and this is Vikramshila. This is Vikramshila. The previous image is that of the Paharpur University, and this is yes. So it was supposed to be like a rock, supposed to be a mountain, but of course, Bangladesh or modern day Bengal, these are mostly plains. So they deliberately used this kind of a structure to give it an impression of a great rock, or rock cut monastery, a rock cut university, which you can find in some parts. For example, in some part of Western India, Krishnagiri. If you have ever visited Mumbai, you will find the Krishnagiri called Kanheri these days. So it was a kind of a rock cut. And so here you have the Somapura University. This is Vikramshila University, named after Dharmapal himself. Dharmapala's Virud was Vikramshila, like Jayanaga's Virud was Prakanda Yasha. So Vikramshila is in modern day Bihar. So the Palas rule a part of Bihar. Now I probably do not have any image from the Sena period. Yes, I believe I have. I have Bollal Dhipi. We have to go to the next. We have to go to the main. Yes, Bollal Dhipi. Yes. So here, this is in modern day Nodia district. This is an image of Bollal Dhipi. And we can go to the, now the emergence of the Senas, they were really the vassals of the Palas, and they were equally, they came from outside. This is Bollal Bari, not to be confused with Bollal Dhipi. This is in modern day Murshidabad district. This is in Gaura. So this is Bollal Bari. And so these are ancient architectures, ruins which are associated with the names of Bollal Shen. Now, Bollal Shen is perhaps the most colorful and also the most controversial character in the whole of early Bengali history. Like everything in India today tends to get blamed on Nehru, medieval Bengal had Bollal Shen to blame. So whatever, went wrong, they said that, okay, this is because of Bollal Shen. He was a controversial character. He was also a colorful character. And sometimes it has been said, Nripeshu Bollal Sreshto. I'm here quoting from Dinesh Chandra Sen, translation is mine. He was, Bollal Shen, was the blue-eyed boy for the elders. He religiously donated by the sacrificial fire. He was a scholar within the royal court. He was a valiant warrior on the battlefield. He was a cunning deceiver for his enemies. He was a lecherous drunkard in the chamber of his concubine. And the sages of his era used to respect him, saying, Nripeshu Bollal Sreshto. His marriage with Padmini sharply divided Bengali society. Now, Bollal Padmini, I mean, that was a big controversy, and there was civil war. Lakshman Sena will fight against his father on this issue. And this marriage, however, perhaps signifies Bollal Shen's conversion to some form of tantric cult of male-female union, which is equivalent to the Buddhist Yoganatha, which later on would be encompassed within the Shakta religion. In fact, Bollal's name is evoked in the legends associated with both Kalighat and Dhakeshwari, which is in Dhaka. the two biggest modern day Shakti temples. Lakshmana Sena, I do not have anything associated with his name, any image here, but he has been called by Minhaj in Tabaqat-i Nasiri as the greatest king of his times and the king who was most respected in India. And the fountainhead of Gauriya Vaishnava religion, which is Jayadava's Gita Govinda, that probably originated in Lakshmana Sena's court. As we end today's discussion, I believe it has become evident that some kind of, is it possible to go back to that Chandraketugarh image of that mother goddess? I just want to, the Ganga Hridai folder, I just want you guys to have a look at that Panchachura. Yes, that Panchachura. Just have a look at it as we end this discussion. And I believe it has become evident that the theory of political leadership is deeply embedded into the cultural narrative of Prakriti, which is expressed in the gynocentric symbolism of mother worship as the material and the immaterial world, the realms of the animate and the realms of the inanimate come together to constitute this Prakriti. It has been rightly observed as a materialist doctrine in its original form, which in turn postulates that mind came from matter. So we have this celebration of the divine union of Prakriti and Purusha as opposed to the dissociation of Prakriti and Purusha, which you find in many ideologies, most notably in classical Sankhya. Now, still Prakriti from classical Sankhya in its available form, it might not be sufficient, but still it is probably the closest we can get to the original form of this mother worshipping culture, which has given birth to these powerful polities across a span of 3,000 years. And starting from Panduraja GB to the Sena era, repeatedly we find that some form of mother goddess worship has defined our cultural narrative and therefore has created the preconditions of our political emergence. And I end my discussion here. And thank you for your time. Over to you, Shukriyadi.
Okay. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk, and we have a lot of questions, but I don't think we have to, I mean, I have a lot of questions, but Madhuvanti is going to attend to some questions that we have from the attendees. So over to you, Madhuvanti. Thank you.
So one of the question is from Priyadipta Mishra. He says, sir, you told that the Iron Pillar of Delhi was constructed by a King Chandra, probably Chandravarman, but some books by reputed historians along with Wikipedia is mentioning that the pillar was made by Chandragupta II. So can you name the book or any documents where Chandravarma is mentioned? It will be helpful for me as I'm preparing for my UPSC.
Ramesh Chandra Majumdar, that immediately coming to my mind. And besides, some other historians have observed the kind of temporality which is there and the kind of language which is used there. For example, it has been observed, and even, you know, I went to Qutub Minar and I looked at that Iron Pillar inscription, the full text of which is actually written somewhere, I mean, for the ease of reading. And because, of course, you cannot go near the Iron Pillar because it's like cordoned. So I looked at that language. It looks very much like Gauri Riti. Now, Gauri Riti, of course, the name will come later, but we know there is a particular type of aesthetic, there is a particular type of stylistics, which later on comes to be known as Gauri Riti. Now, that particular type of writing, you consult any professor of Sanskrit, it, to my mind, it bears a very close resemblance to the school of stylistics known as Gauri Riti. But of course, I mean, if you are looking for like reputed historians who think that Chandravarma might have something to do the Iron Pillar, then RC. Yes. Next.
So the next question is from Nalinaksha Bhattacharya. He says, regarding Mahapadmananda being the ruler of Ganma Hridaya and becoming the ruler of Magad, won't it place Ganga Hridaya in the vicinities of modern day Patna?
Quintus Curtius Rufus, he speaks of Agramus And Agrames is, of course, Agrasenya, and Agrasenya is Dhanananda. Dhanananda's father was Ugrasena. Ugrasena is another name of Mahapadmananda. So he's really speaking of Agrames. And he is, so by that point of time when he's writing about Agrames, okay? And Agrames, Dhanananda, that is, by that point of time, the epicenter actually moved to Magadha, because this dynasty was ruling the whole of India, almost the whole of India. Nanda Empire is the first all India empire. So therefore, its location at that point of time, at the time of Agrames, because Quintus Curtius Rufus, he's not actually writing about Mahapadmananda, he is writing about Agrames. So by the time of Agrames, it is in Magadha. But Ugrasena, the indication is very clear. Gangaridai king and becomes the king of Magadha. That is Prasi.
Just mentioning that if anyone else has question, please raise your hand as well. I'll read the next question from Vaskar. He says, how do we know that these are goddesses and not just some female form?
Plenty of indications. For example, the images which you find on the coins, you will find that there is a divinity there. For example, there is Kumbhabhishek. Okay, so there are some Aishwarya Lakshana. If you look at Indian philosophy, so there are certain divine symbolisms. The symbolisms are here. For example, that image with which I wanted to end today's discussion, this is not just any female figure. You can look at its dimensions. So you can look at the magnanimity, and you can look at the repetition, which is not just like any female figure. You cannot have the same idol in its some variants. Like some variants have 12 hairpins, some hairpins are of course weapons, and some variants have 10 hairpins, but this is repeated. And having these great weapons as hairpins, so repeatedly, you have these suggestions of magnanimity, and of course something which is of larger than life. So of course, these are not any images. And of course, when you come to the Shashanko coins and the Pala coins, the implication is more than obvious. And of course, you have these mother goddesses who continually dominate from Panduraja Devi to Senapati. So that it's a concept.
His follow-up question was, I'm talking about the old figurines.
You are probably talking about the Panduraja TV figurines. Yes, the Panduraja TV figurines are not as magnanimous as the ones you find from Gangaridai onwards. Yes, I agree on that. Yes, true. Here probably, in case of Panduraja TV, the stage of civilization was not really as prosperous, as big, as gigantic, and therefore, as the later day Gangaridai, and therefore they only started to make their presence. They had a big citadel, of course, but yes, those are considered to be mother goddesses by Paresh Chandra Dasgupta, and Ramesh Chandra Majumdar agrees with him. So we will go with the flow. We will agree with them.
The next question is from Purabi. They ask, has Brahmalipi been deciphered?
Yes, it was done long ago by Alexander Cunningham during the British period, and that Mahastangar inscription which I showed you, it's written in the earliest recorded Brahmi from our part of the world, that is, like modern day Bengal and Bangladesh, and so yes, it has been deciphered. That Mahastangar inscription has been deciphered, and the full text is available in Nihar Ranjan Roy's Bangalir Itihash. If you go there, and you'll find the full text, the full transcription of this.
Thank you.
Mahastangar inscription.
We have some live questions from our attendees. I have unmuted the first question, the first attendee for the question. His ID on the list shows as owner, so I don't know the name. So I would request him to kindly go ahead and ask the question. I have unmuted you from the attendees.
Yes. Okay. Right, I cannot hear anything.
Yeah, we cannot hear anything, Otri. Maybe you should move to the next question.
Okay. The next question is from Mr. Kaushik Ghosh. Please go ahead and ask your question.
The question is, how...
Sorry.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Cannot hear anything else.
The microphone was muted on his side. I'm trying to unmute him. Yes.
I've unmuted it.
Yes. Please go ahead.
Yes,
Okay.
now I can.
So when we think about goddesses, first of all, the images were amazing. And the one that you ended it with was like, just like unbelievable. And the fact that the weapons stick out from the head and not the hands is also particular. So I cannot even wrap my mind around it. All I can think about is the position of Bengali women or women from the East in the way we have known in our generation, because I feel like I'm probably your generation, and the way we have known this and experienced this. How can we extrapolate this to an idea that is thousands of years old and to the notion that we have only understood in the form of movies that we have watched, like Devi, you know, Chotrit Roy's Devi, or the horrors of child marriage, or Vidyashagar, or all of this, anything that's close to us. And how can we or can we even extrapolate this to the idea that is so far away from us?
Yeah, I get your question. There will be two dimensions to the answer that I want to present you with. I don't know whether it will satisfy you. One thing is this, that Bengal does not have any natural boundary on the western side. Northern side, yes, we have the Himalayas, and the eastern side, yes, I mean those hilly regions which separate us from the rest of the world. Western side, it's open, and nobody ever built any kind of a Chinese wall. So continual, so continual influences will come. Some of them good, some of them bad, some of them ugly, and therefore it's not possible to retain that original purity. For example, I mean that Gangadhara civilization, it's totally lost. Nobody knows what was the name of that goddess. Nobody knows. I mean, I sometimes tend to call her Doshayudha because Panchachura is not really a satisfactory name, because it's like, you know, I mean, it's just an Apsara who came out of that Samudra Manthan. It does not just. So, yes, so this is probably one reason why we lost and why we were increasingly engulfed by paternalistic and patriarchal kind of theologies and ideologies which were coming from the West. Here, of course, I have in my mind the non-tantric form of Hinduism coming from northern India. Okay, because I look at, when I'm looking at Ali Bengal, I realize that here I'm looking at a non-Vedic kind of a culture, very tantric.
Yeah, of course.
So the supremacy of the, and how the world is expressed through the gynocentric symbolism. So that culture had to continually suffer onslaughts. Like Panduraja TV, it was burned down. And so somehow we had to, you know, like we fall down, and then again we gather ourselves together, and then again we walk. But in that process we get wounded. Okay, I mean, some of the core gets damaged. It continually gets damaged over the thousands of years. So that is one dimension. The second dimension I would love to point out is that Satyajit Ray was a Brahmo. Devi was written by Prabhat Kumar, but the story conception, the idea was given by Rabindranath Tagore. He was a Brahmo. Now Brahmos, while they were propagating their religion, I'm sorry if that creates a cognitive dissonance in your mind or any other person's mind, but Brahmo movement in Bengal, as it was actually struggling for its survival in the 20th century, it was already past its prime. Okay, I mean, when Devi is written or when Devi is actually being filmed, Brahmo movement is past its prime. It's actually in a derelict condition. Now they had this big rival they had to fight with, and that is the mother goddess. Because Brahmo religion, you can understand, it's Upanishad.
Yeah.
It's Brahma, it's Parama Brahma. Okay, so this is some kind of a supreme father. So they had to attack. They had to attack that mother. So apropos Satyajit Ray's Devi, that would be my dimension too. But otherwise, of course, I mean, we get wounded. We continually get wounded.
It's very interesting. Thank you.
We have one more question from Arunabh Chatterjee. He asked, did Vedic Upanishad influence this culture, or were they mainly tantric?
You see, the influence of Tantra is already there in some rudimentary form in Rig Veda itself. Ratri Sukta of Rig Veda, some people have considered that this Ratri probably was some kind of a primordial mother who was worshipped and who was feared worshipped by maybe our ancestors and feared by maybe the ancestors of modern day Northern Indians who wrote the Vedas, the Rig Veda. So the influence already is creeping inside, and by the time we have Upanishad, we have the influence of Sankhya, the very idea of dissociation. The classical Sankhya speaks about the dissociation of Purusha with Prakriti. Now, that is not just classical Sankhya. I mean, in Upanishad, the kind of philosophy which you see, which is propagated there, that is very much derived from, and you have the influence by the time Upanishad is being written. So I definitely look at it in this way, that the notion of Prakriti, there are onslaughts, and so we have this Purusha, and what the Purusha is supposed to be associated, to be divorced. Prakriti is something which is bad, evil. You have to come out of its influence. But then, of course, I mean, there are counter reformations to that. I mean, so to say, I'm using a European term. So here, I mean, some people, I look at classical Sankhya as a very much a Protestant movement. Okay, I mean, wanted a dissociation. So Upanishad is very much influenced by classical Sankhya. Not just Upanishad, you will find the same thing in Gita as well. So of course, I mean, this kind of, and Sankhya is of course propagated by Kapil, whose ashram was in modern day Ganga Sagar. So yes, so my answer would be this, that Upanishad is definitely under the influence of some form of Prakriti-centric philosophy, which whether classical Sankhya or Tantra, I mean, and by the time of Atharva Veda, the influence is paramount. So we continue to like influence. While in my previous answer, I actually spoke about the onslaughts, but there is no reason to believe that we did not have counter onslaughts. We had. Our ancestors had, so we continue. And you have 51 Shakti Peethas in the different parts of the subcontinent, though most of them are in the eastern region. So yes, I mean, we continue to influence. We also influence others. Next question.
Do we have any more questions, Otri?
No, we don't have any more questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Dasgupta. It was wonderful. And to all the attendees, if you have any question, you can email it to us. We can forward it to Dr. Dasgupta. And an announcement that next Saturday we have another lecture by Dr. Thibaut du Heubert, and he will be talking about lyric poetry in pre-colonial Bengal. And Dr. Dasgupta, if you ever come to Vancouver, we can show you our Vancouver Bengali hospitality. Thank you once again very, very much. Okay.
Most welcome.
Good. Good day.